Good afternoon. It is 2 o'clock and time to start the meeting, please. Item 1 on the agenda is declarations of interest. Members should be aware that we are using the chat box for any request to speak. I don't see any declaration of interest. Item 2 on the agenda is urgent business. Nothing has been brought to my attention. Item 3 on the agenda is apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Cox.
Thank you. For the benefit of visitors to the committee, I would like to make 1 or 2 introductions. I am Councillor Nick Peel and I am Chair of this committee for the current municipal year. We also have Sue Johnson, Director of Corporate Resources, Tony Glennon, Head of Exchequer Services, Andrew Wright, Audit Manager, Richard Thomas, Deputy Head of Internal Audit and Risk Management, and Tom Powell, Head of Audit and Risk Management for Bolton Council. The Council's external auditors are also present, and we welcome Karen Murray and Ian Pinches from Mazars. Helen Gorman is representing Democratic Services, also with us. Item 4, excuse me, item 4 on the agenda are the minutes of the previous meeting. These have been circulated previously. Are members happy that they are a correct record? If you disagree, please let me know via chat. Otherwise, could someone who was at the meeting move them as a correct record?
I move them, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Hayes. The next item of business is item 5, the annual governance statement, and I'm going to hand over to Mr. Powell.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep the introductions relatively brief in terms of this report. The annual governance statement is a required statement that is signed and approved by the leader and the chief executive, and is published alongside the annual accounts, and it's presented for Audit Committee to note as part of your role. It describes in section 4 in high level the key components of the Council's governance framework, and in sections 5 and 6 reflects on areas for further development that we may wish to focus on to enhance the effectiveness of our overall governance arrangements within the Council. And these are areas that are proposed by officers for additional focus in 2020-21. That's all I'll say by way of introduction, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. I then open this up to members for comments or questions. As I say, please use the chat facility. Okay, I'm receiving no indication there. So can members please agree to note the statement? We will now hand over to Helen Gorman for the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Galloway? 4. Councillor Howarth?
4.
Councillor Hayes?
4.
Councillor Peel?
4.
That's 4 in favour, Chair.
Thank you very much. The next item of business is item 6, the Head of Audit and Risk Management Annual Audit Opinion. Hand over again to Mr. Powell.
Thank you again, Chair. Okay, so yes, my second report is my annual opinion, as you say. So in line with public sector audit standards, I'm required to give my independent head of audit opinion on the Council systems of governance, risk management and internal control. And this relates to the municipal year, or the financial year, sorry, 2019-20. The scope of the work that the team has done during the year is set out in section 2, and in section 3 is my commentary on key observations from an internal audit perspective throughout the year. You will note in there that I've reflected and provided a high level of assurance across a range of areas that continue to be well and strongly operated across the Council. And I've highlighted some areas, as you might expect, in paragraph 3.6, where there may be where there's potential for further improvement. Just to reassure members of the committee, management are fully aware of all these areas, and I am confident that actions are being taken to address a number of those. That's all I'll say in terms again of the opinion, Chair, but there's a lot of detail at the back of the report should members have any questions or comments.
Thank you for that report, Mr. Powell. I will invite members to make comments or questions, and Councillor Howarth.
Thank you, Chair. I first want to raise something under 6.4.
Just wait till it goes live.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much. I first want to raise something under 6.44, where it talks about government discretionary relief grant awards administered by councils. I just want to be clear, which grants is it being mentioned nationally that there is now fraud concern over? If you've come across that, whether it's more other grants or whether it's the grants that you mention here. So what correspondence have you received from government specifically? If I can ask you about that, about fraud concern on any of the COVID-19 grants. That's not to suggest I'm making an accusation about Bolton. I'm really speaking to the issue that's been highlighted for the country, actually. And I think the question, though, I acknowledge, is not just about audit. It's also, isn't it, because it's such a matter of today, a question about operational services as well. I've got a second question that I'll ask after that, if that's okay, Mr. Powell, Chair.
Okay, yes, thank you, Councillor. Yes, just to reaffirm, they are the grants that we have administered on behalf of central government. So they include things like the retail, hospitality and leisure grants and the new discretionary grant scheme. So effectively money that was provided via central resources for local authorities to distribute within their individual boroughs and conurbations. The concern primarily around fraud risk was the pace and scale of those payments nationally, and there was a lot of money that has been paid out. Bolton, in common with most local authorities, have taken reasonable steps to ensure that when we were making payments, that we knew who we were paying, why we were paying them, their eligibility criteria, etc. But nonetheless, given the size and the value of the payments, there is considered to be an inherent risk of fraud in those areas. I'm not aware of any particular cases in Bolton, but I am aware of some others nationally and across the region as well. In terms of correspondence from government, it has been made very clear to the authority that government expects to see a range of work to identify any potential frauds in these areas. And I, on behalf of the director, will be responding back to central government. I think they're saying at the moment on a monthly basis to report any issues or concerns. There are none highlighted to me at present, Councillor, but that will be an area of ongoing focus for us.
Councillor Howarth, you have another question.
Yes, I've got a second one. Thank you. Right, in 3.6, you talk about the implementation of the audit recommendations, and that gets discussed a bit more in section 5. And this is all about action to timescales, where you do identify some failure. So you're implementing specific assurance requests, and they'll be issued to senior managers. May I request then that a copy of them will find its way into possibly leader or deputy leader, if you like, if that's easier than an ask for all appropriate executive cabinet members, because as a member of the audit committee, that gives me an additional assurance. The point I'm making is to support the audit system to say, absolutely, you don't want to carry on with any delay on this important work that you do, where you want to ensure that actions are implemented. Thank you.
Yes, happy to take that Sorry, thank you, Chair. Yes, happy to take that forward, Councillor. I think I'll be presenting a report to the corporate leadership team, and I think maybe a copy of that report going, as you suggest, to the leader or deputy leader, I think would be welcomed in terms of support for the process. I do appreciate colleagues have been very busy recently, but it is an important fact that we do need to, or important factor that we do need to be ensuring we're implementing these agreed actions. So happy to take that forward as you suggest, Councillor.
Thanks for those questions, Councillor Howarth. No other member is indicating. So Mrs. Gorman, can we please take the vote on agreement of this report?
Thank you, Chair. Please would you confirm whether you agree to note the Head of Audit and Risk Management annual audit opinion by stating for, against or abstain? Councillor Galloway.
For.
Councillor Howarth.
For.
Councillor Hayes.
For.
Councillor Peel.
For.
Thank you. That's 4 votes in favour.
Thank you. The next item of business is item 7. This is the draft internal audit plan, and I think Ms. Powell's third and final report.
It is indeed, Chair. Yes, mercifully, you'll be done with me after this one for you. Yes, this is my proposed annual audit plan for the year 2020-21. As members will appreciate, it's been an unusual start to the year in terms of trying to come up with an audit plan. But accordance with the standards, I've set this forward for yourselves, and this is for your approval as the audit committee. There's 2 layers of approval to the audit plan, which is the corporate leadership team and the audit committee. The report sets out the approach we've taken in terms of developing the plan, and notes that a lot of the work in the first quarter has been spent completing last year's work, but also in the initial challenges of the COVID response, including the grants that Councillor Howarth has helpfully referred to. There's a lot of scoping work currently ongoing with clients to bring a bit more detail to some of these audit areas, and that will progress during the year. But what I've done is highlight in Appendix 1, or described in Appendix 1, the areas we plan to focus on, and that does include, for example, substantial work supporting colleagues in the business rates section around the business grants programme and the payments in that particular area. I would ask from an audit committee perspective that you bear with me in terms of the plan remaining flexible in the year. We're currently starting the process of the corporate risk register refresh, and there may be other issues and risk areas that appropriately need some audit assurance that mean I need to change the plan around. But if I do so, I will bring that back in front of yourselves for your oversight and approval. And that's all I'll say in terms of the plan, but again, happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Tony. Any questions? Councillor Howarth.
Thank you. Just one, actually. Certainly after you've highlighted you do want to keep flexibility. I would say I'm keen to have you consider some prioritisation though on in the all box from last year. One thing did stand out, and that's audit on procurement of social value. The reason why that came to mind is, of course, the economic challenge that the borough now faces because of COVID and the unpleasant business of what we consider to be, if I call it economic challenge. And I suppose the reason why I'm looking for prioritisation is that this social value in procurement connects to, you know, getting every last drop of benefit around Bolton jobs, around those that provide services in Bolton. I mean, you know, I won't go on. Many on this call understand what that title of procurement social value is. Thank you, Mr. Powell.
Okay, yes, so that was there is an audit that's just being completed as part of last year's plan, which was looking at the upfront framework. What I would say I think is worth us covering this year, Councillor, is probably the monitoring of the social value benefits. So happy to take that away and include that in the scoping, because I think that would be an important area and an appropriate assurance both for officers and members. So happy to take that away and include that in it.
Thank you for that, Ms. Powell. So there's no other members indicating. Can we agree the report, Mrs. Gorman?
Thank you, Chair. Please, would you confirm whether you agree the draft internal audit plan by stating for, against or abstain? Councillor Galloway.
For.
Councillor Howarth.
For.
Councillor Hayes.
For.
Councillor Peel.
For.
That's another unanimously carried decision.
Thank you. The next item of business is item 8. This is the accounting policies and critical judgments, and I'm going to invite Tony Glennon to speak on this report.
Thanks, Chair. The accounting policies and critical judgments section of the year-end statement of accounts are the key decisions that we've taken with regard to how we account for all the council's transactions in the year. Each year, CITFA produces a number of documents, such as the annual accounting code and its guidance for practitioners publications, which are our primary reference documents in compiling these. So the sections are written after consulting these publications and hence underpin our statement. Once approved, these documents will appear in the year-end statement of accounts, which you will hopefully see in the next few weeks, all being well. That's all I want to say, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
I'm not receiving any requests for questions. So if that's the case, we will then go to the votes. Mrs. Gorman.
Thank you, Chair. Please would you confirm whether you agree to note the accounting policies and critical judgments by stating for, against or abstain? Councillor Galloway.
For.
Councillor Howarth.
For.
Councillor Hayes.
For.
And Councillor Peel.
For.
That's 4 in favour and no against.
Thank you. We now move to item 9, which is the Mayor's Audit Work Plan, and I'm going to ask Ms. Murray to present this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This paper is our audit strategy memorandum, so that's another title, if you like, for the audit plan that sets out the work that we need to do to give our opinions on the council's statement of accounts and its value for money conclusion for 2019-20, so the financial year just ended. Much of the content of the report is driven by professional standards, so it is a fairly lengthy document, and I appreciate members will have read it, so I'm just going to pull out a few points of detail if that's okay. You will see on page 6, which details more of the background around our audit scope, a timetable for the audit which is set out in a graphic. We've just entered the detailed fieldwork phase of that now, so the June-July quarter, so that's the kind of third segment in the pie, if you like, as you work around that diagram in a clockwise direction. And it's probably worth me just mentioning the detail behind that and the content of the following page, which just references the changes to the national timetable that the council can work to this year, given the COVID pandemic. So you will be aware, I'm sure, that previously you have been required to have your accounts ready for audit by the 31st of May, and that audit, as your auditors, we've been working towards the 31st of July reporting date. And CLG have taken the opportunity, or have taken advantage of the pandemic, if you like, to relax that timetable for both councils and auditors. And I think that was to recognise really the pressure that's on both your finance team and on the council more widely in dealing with the problems that arose between the middle of March and currently. So the deadlines have been changed now so that the council's accounts did not need to be ready until the 31st of August, with an expectation that we would report by the 30th of November. I'm very pleased to say that your finance team managed actually to work really well despite the challenges that they faced in March and April. And actually we got some accounts only a little bit after the deadline of the 31st of May, as it would have been. We are working really hard to meet the July normal timetable, but think you will appreciate that it's not quite a business as usual situation, and we are finding that things are a little more challenging. Not all of the challenges are within the council's gift to solve, and that's another important thing to mention. So some of the pressures come from other parts of the things that feed your accounts, like your valuation information and like information from your pensions actuary. So it's just worth bearing in mind that not all of it is in your gift to address. However, we are working very hard and we will report back to you in July. The report sets out for you the materiality level that we're working to, and you'll see that that's been set at just under £14 million, so that's 13.8 million. That reflects really the size and scale of the council's operations and is consistent with the figures that we've worked to in previous years, taking account of changes in the council spend. And you will see that we've identified a reporting threshold of just over £400,000 for you. But I do want to make clear to members that there are some items below that materiality level where we will still focus a significant amount of our effort to make sure that disclosures are correct. And the best example of that really is the senior officer remuneration, because it would be inappropriate for that to be reported wrong, even to a very small figure. So we will look at that in some detail. The report goes through then the significant risks. So I'm looking at pages 11 onwards. And in the case of the accounts, when we talk about significant risk, we mean the risk that if the number is wrong, could be materially so wrong by more than the £14 million that I just mentioned. The areas that we identify as significant risk are the management override of controls, and it's important to be aware that that is a presumed risk that professional standards identify for every auditor to consider in every organisation. It's not a specific thing for Bolton. It is something that we have to look at everywhere. And it recognises the fact that the decisions that management make around, for example, the exercise of their judgment, around the calculation of estimates, about the journals that they post, are actually an opportunity to directly influence the financial statements. So we will do, and always do some work to look at those things in particular. And it links to the accounting policies that Tony's just chatted through. The next area for us is your property, plant and equipment valuation, and that's because it's a very, very big number, and of course it's a complex estimate where you are reliant on help from the council's valuer in order to identify the values that should be included in the council's financial statements. And as I mentioned previously, the pension liability, where you are reliant on the actuary, but again, that's a very big and complex estimate. The other area that professional standards require us to consider is the significant risk in respect of revenue recognition. So that's the income that the council recognises in its accounts. But actually for a local authority like Bolton, we tend not to presume that that is a significant risk. And that's because a lot of your income comes from things like grants or council tax and business rates, where we can directly track the transactions. And it's not about the way in which you exercise your judgment. We will, of course, carry out some work on it, but not to the level of a significant risk. We've identified a couple of enhanced risks this year, which are not that different from the ones we've had in previous years either, and where we'll focus our attention. It's not got the same risk of material error, but nevertheless sensitive and at risk of error. The first area there is in respect of the valuation of your shareholding in Manchester Airport. And the second one is the way in which you account for schools, so whether schools are on or off balance sheet, depending on their categorisation. The report then goes on to talk about the value for money conclusion and the risk that we are able to give a conclusion that the council has proper arrangements in place, taking properly informed decisions and deploying resources to achieve planned and sustainable outcomes for people in Bolton. There are 3 sub-criteria relating to informed decision making, sustainable resource deployment and the way in which you work with your partners. And I think you might be aware from last year that we have talked previously about the way in which you engage with third parties to deliver services and benefits for people in Bolton. The 2 specific areas that we'll be concentrating on as risk areas this year are your financial resilience and sustainability. So I'm thinking about this in a pre-COVID situation. So how the council was looking after its budget in the 1920 financial year, how you were planning to address savings going forwards and whether or not those arrangements are still adequately robust. And then we will look at the way in which you work with partners, and particularly in respect of the governance and decision making around your regeneration agenda. The rest of the paper is what I am required to report by professional standards, so it covers matters like our fees, our independence, and when and how we will report to you. So Chair, I'm very happy to leave it there, but to take any questions from members if there are any.
You're on
Chair,
mute.
you're on mute at the moment.
Doesn't matter how much you do these live events, you still forget to unmute yourself. I was just saying, Karen, thank you for the positive feedback you gave to the finance team for being able to fulfil those deadlines whilst we're in the midst of this crisis. I'll bring in Councillor Howarth.
Thank you, Chair. I want to ask about materiality on finance, if I can, if that's okay. Thank you. You mentioned the threshold of 400,000. I just want to understand a bit more again, though, in terms of maladministrations, if that's the phrase I can use. I get how you will nearly always identify medium and large size issues, but I just want to get my head round again. What about the effect of, say, 10 or 20 quite small, what we might call maladministrations? How do you work in relation to that as an auditor? Thank you. And then I've got a second question. Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor. So just to explain, you've used the phrase maladministration. I would use the phrase misstatement. So I'm looking at those as errors or mistakes in the accounts, if you like, not something that is deliberate in the way that maladministration might suggest. What we do is we do test to a much lower level. So when we pick our items to actually look at and test in detail, we'll pick some fairly low value items as well as some of the higher value items. So everything that's very big gets looked at as a matter of routine, but we do then take a sample of smaller items. And if we identify errors in those, we do something with them. So if they're an isolated error and it's below the £400,000, we talk to management about why it's arisen and what the cause of it is and what should happen. If it is absolutely an isolated error, not as a result of a control failure, then management can decide whether or not they want to amend the accounts or leave them. If they amend them, even if they are less than that £400,000 figure that we talk about, we would report them to you. If they were errors or issues that arose as a result of a control failure, even if they were below that £400,000, we would still report them to you. If an error that we identify or the cumulative effect of a lot of small errors would move the accounts in one direction, so all going the same way, either increasing income or reducing income or increasing expenditure or reducing expenditure in the year, by more than £400,000, we would report them to you. Now, we report them to you as one of two things. Either management have already amended the accounts to reflect and correct, or management have declined to do so. You, as those charged with governance, have the final say on whether or not you want them to be amended. So if you decide to go with management's judgment that it doesn't need to be amended, you need to formally say so. We then accept that. Now, typically in Bolton, when we identify a number of smaller issues, management amend them anyway. And that's because over time, those individually small things or collectively relatively small things can build up and become a cumulative problem that you're carrying forward for several years. So your finance team prefer to amend. It's probably also worth saying that we do something called an extrapolation on very small errors. So we ask ourselves, if that mistake that we found was representative of the population as a whole, what would it look like and how would that affect the council's accounts? And we consider whether we need to report that to you or not. If an error that we identify is above the materiality figure or actually very close to that materiality figure, so that's the 13.8 million that I've mentioned, then I won't sign the accounts unless they're amended. So management don't have a choice there, but we will of course report them to you. Now, material errors are relatively unusual, but they do arise in areas like the pension fund valuation, where you're given information by your actuary, who may subsequently change that information and report a separate valuation to you that you need to take into account. Or it can happen typically on your property, plant and equipment valuation simply because the numbers are so big. So I hope that explains that. If you want to come back on that, please do.
No, thank you. That was very, very thorough, and I'm going to absolutely use that word misstatements. It's much better, of course, than what I used. The other question, Chair, I just want to touch on the work of Mazars, our external auditor, in terms of value for money. I just want to find out whether this does relate to whether you will give a view on the council's use of reserves, our reserves position, and also any options you feel that Bolton as a local authority has on borrowing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So that's a more difficult question to answer, because what we don't do is give a view on council policy. So what I am looking at is whether or not the council has got arrangements in place to make proper decisions. So are the right things going to the right decision-making committee or forum? Are the right people involved, and are you taking the right advice? So where your Section 151 officer, Mrs Johnson, as your Director of Corporate Resources, gives advice on the minimum level of reserves, are you paying heed to that advice? I might separately look at whether that advice is appropriate, or would I massively disagree with the numbers that Mrs Johnson has calculated as being the right number. But it tends not to be that we're commenting on policy. That's not our role. So we are really more interested in making sure that the arrangements that underpin the decisions that the council takes are proper arrangements. So I tend not to comment on the level of borrowing either, other than to note whether it looks high, medium or low, whether you've increased it significantly or not. And if you have, that you have gone through a correct process to make those decisions and reach those conclusions. But they are absolutely decisions for the council to take.
Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you. Any further questions, members? If not, we'll go to the vote on accepting this report. Ms Scarman.
Thank you, Chair. Please would you confirm whether you agree to note Mazars' audit work plan by stating for, against or abstain? Councillor Galloway.
For.
Councillor Howarth.
For.
Councillor Hayes.
For.
Councillor Peel.
For.
That's all in favour. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, members. The next item of business is item 10, which is an update on last year's objection. I understand that questions from members should be related to the process and not the actual details of the objection. So just hand over to Ms Murray for the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be aware that we received an objection to the Council's accounts for the financial year 2018-19. It related to a relatively small amount of money that was paid as a grant to a third-party organisation, a voluntary group that the Council works with. We are still looking at the detail of that objection. We had done a considerable amount of work on it, and I was optimistic that we would have been able to report back by now. But unfortunately, all of the information supplied to us by the objector was in hard copy. And you will appreciate that in the middle of March, we had to lock down our offices. We did that slightly ahead of the national lockdown. And unfortunately, until last week, we weren't able to access the office in any capacity at all, which will give us an opportunity to collect those papers and deal with them. I thought it might be helpful, therefore, if I explain what I think is going to happen next in terms of process, just so that members have got some background and some understanding. So we will collect those papers from the office in the next week or two, and we will conclude the work that we need to do. At that point, we will draft what is called a draft statement of reasons, which we will share with the elector who has made the objection and with the council. Both parties will then be given a period of time that I think will be 21 days, and that's in order to recognising that some people have difficulty accessing the office and photocopies and printers and all of those things at the moment. So they'll both be given 21 days to come back to me with any final evidence that they believe we should have considered and haven't. We will then from there go on to form a view and issue and to write what would be a statement of reason, so a judgment on the objection, whether we uphold it or not, and why. At that point, I am required to share that with Public Sector Audit Appointments Limited, who are the appointing body for the council, so that they can consider it from a legal perspective. That usually takes about a week, sometimes 2 weeks if there are any complications in there that they want to consider. They will then come back to me. At that point, I will issue a final statement of reasons and close the objection. Now, the slight caveat to that I just mentioned is that the objector has asked us to consider whether or not we should issue a public interest report. And if we do decide that that is the right thing to do, or we decide we're making a declaration to the court that the item of account was unlawful, then that process will follow that statement of reason. So whether or not the matter is concluded at that point depends on what the outcome is. And at the moment, I'm not able to comment on that at all, as you indicated. So I hope that that's helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that explanation. I don't have any member indicating, and I don't believe, Ms. Gorman, that this is an actual formal decision at this stage.
That's completely right, Chair. It's just for noting.
It's just for noting. Well, in that case, that concludes the business of this committee today, and I declare that this meeting is closed.
Thank you, Chair.